Hello, welcome to Scary Good TV. I am your moderator, Tananarive Due. This is a panel of amazing television horror showrunners. I'll introduce them really briefly before we kick off. We have Greg Nicotero, the showrunner at Creepshow, longtime producer on The Walking Dead, and of course, overall legend. Jami O'Brien, the showrunner of Nosferatu. Meredith Averill, co-showrunner on Locke Key and The Haunting of Hill House. Nick Antosca, of course, you know him from Chucky. He's now an executive producer on the upcoming series, was a showrunner on Channel Zero, and Don Mancini, showrunner on Chucky. So welcome, everyone.
Yay, thank you.
Hey.
Very excited to see all of you and to get this conversation started. Let's just start with an icebreaking question, since we're all kids at heart. What's the first time you remember being really scared by horror on TV, just terrified in your own living room?
Dark Shadows for me.
Ooh,
that's
a good one.
I'm born in the 60s, so I actually learned the word shadow from watching that show at the age of 3 or 4. And specifically, it was the episode where Barnabas Collins hires an artist to age Angelique's portrait. And then he goes and confronts Angelique and he says, "Look at your hands." And she looks at her withered hands and screams in horror. That is one of my earliest memories, period.
I would probably say the first time I actually had nightmares from something I watched on TV was Trilogy of Terror, with the little Zuni fetish doll running around chasing Karen Black. Pretty much. I think I saw a picture of it in the TV guide the day it aired, and I was afraid of the photo, let alone actually watching the episode, the Dan Curtis show. So I would say that one.
Mine was Tales from the Dark Side. Not even because not even necessarily because of the content of the show, but it was the opening credit sequence and the music that kind of just gets stuck in your brain. And it was just this very creepy, eerie, very simple music. And it just terrified me, totally terrified me.
It was X-Files for me. It was Toombs, the liver-eating guy who, pops out of the vent in your house and eats your liver and makes a nest. So I saw that when I was in elementary school, probably. There was and then I didn't want to go near the vents in my house.
Where I grew up in New England, there was a show called Creature Double Feature that was on Saturdays. And I remember I was a really small kid. I don't know what the movie was, but it was some like B-movie vampire movie. And it scared, I still to this day, I remember in order to go to sleep, I had to tell myself a story that if I put the sheets up to my chin, a vampire wouldn't be able to bite my neck and kill me. And I still actually sleep that way because there's still something in there that the vampire is going to get me.
And as you're all pointing out, there has been some great horror television in years past, but we are absolutely undergoing a complete renaissance in horror right now. And with more scrutiny on cop shows, and then we have social justice themes starting to come into some of these other shows. I don't think that horror is going anywhere for a while. I don't know if you all agree. Are we just seeing the tip of the iceberg of the horror renaissance? Why is it thriving so much on television? And what do you think the future of horror on television is?
People ask this question a lot, and I think it's because, there has been, I feel like, a big break where there wasn't a lot of horror TV, and then I feel like it kind of came back with The Walking Dead, which was such a great, super scary pilot, and then of course the show is so fantastic, and I always try to think of the psychological reason for it, but I wonder if it's actually just because it's kind of fun, you know what I mean? And then it's like, it is really exciting to see kind of these shows where social issues are coming in. I feel like it's getting more and more creative, but at the end of the day, it's like, I don't know. I love seeing the zombies on The Walking Dead and what Greg's going to come up with next. And I love, on my show, I love the makeup for Charlie Manx, and people seem to really respond to the vampire kids. And I think that some of it is like, it's like Halloween, I'm sure there's a smarter answer.
No, actually, Jami, that's a really great point, because if you really look at in the last probably 10 or 15 years, Halloween is almost about to surpass Christmas as the most profitable and popular holiday. And I would add to that I do think that the advent of video games has introduced horror to a younger audience. And one of the reasons why I think that The Walking Dead initially reached out to a really broad group of people is a lot of kids that were playing House of the Dead or Resident Evil when they had the third person plastic guns and they were shooting zombies. I think when there was a zombie show, it sort of, they bridged that gap. So where traditionally zombie stuff was guys who, grew up on George Romero stuff, now all of a sudden it was open to a newer audience. And I do think that horror video games really did a lot for opening up horror television.
That's great. I hadn't thought about the video game aspect. Is there any reason to think there's more fearfulness in our culture, or is it just because, as you've said, The Walking Dead helped kick it off, and then we have the video games?
Historically, you see horror having a renaissance in moments of cultural unrest. I mean, you look at the movie that made me want to tell stories or be in the horror space was Night of the Living Dead, which I saw at probably 8 or 9, way too young to understand that it was, a microcosm of society and this group of people who are like a set of different parts of America beset by an other, and there's whole allegory there. I think the best horror, the horror that we love and that really lasts, is like about something else. This is The Shining. It's about an abusive father, and your father's supposed to protect you and love you, and instead he's coming after you with an axe. And The Exorcist is about your teenage daughter is changing, and the younger generation is. And I think that we have an opportunity in horror now sometimes to explore the sense of pervasive dread in our all around us, which is more true right now than ever.
Kind of interesting to think that The Shining, when it was first released 40 years ago, it wasn't that successful, it wasn't that popular, but it's only grown in the cultural consciousness in the intervening decades. And I wonder if that might have something to do with what Nick just alluded to, which was that at heart, that story is about abuse in a family. And that is something that I think culturally we are talking about a lot more now in the last, arguably 10 to 20 years than we were 40 years ago. I wonder if that has something to do with why that movie has only expanded in the cultural consciousness.
Well, and that's a great segue to my next question, which has to do with the fears of children. Sometimes the memories of people who have actually undergone trauma themselves, or for some reason, there's something about children in horror that we find really, really appealing, including in a lot of your shows, Locke Key. I assume Chucky, I haven't seen it yet. Of course, Channel Zero, Candle Cove was very child-centered, and Nosferatu has the vampire children. So what is this irresistible appeal of exploring a child's experience in a horrific situation? And what are some of the challenges of creating horror that centers young people, especially on TV? Like, what's the line between, oh, that's terrifying, and oh, we really shouldn't do that? And is that a decision in the room, or is that coming from notes from an executive?
Well, with Locke and Key, we made a conscious decision when Carlton Cuse and I were developing it for Netflix to lean more into the fantasy elements of the show, of the graphic novel series, than the horror elements. More kind of Harry Potter, Narnia than sort of graphic gore and violence. And so we had this actor, Jackson Robert Scott, who plays Bodhi, who's like a 10-year-old boy in our show. He was Georgie in It. So, he had Pennywise murder him in a storm drain in a really graphic way that I'm sure everyone remembers. And He also then went on to go play a little boy who was possessed by a serial killer and tried to kill his parents. So I think when he came to Locke and Key, it was probably like Sesame Street, given his last experiences. But, you know, and so even though we decided to develop this tone that was, you know, it's not family friendly, but it allows for a larger audience, more of a Harry Potter, even Stranger Things audience. So even though he and his older siblings are sort of faced with these, you know, really horrific, scary situations, life and death stakes, there's a demon that's trying to kill them, they witness the murder of their father, you know, because tonally we had made that shift more towards fantasy, we felt that we were okay in protecting any question of what was too far. And then certainly there were things in the graphic novel where, you know, that would have been more of a question. There's, you know, a part in the graphic novel where he gets possessed by a demon and he throws his best friend in front of a bus. So it's a question of, do you want to go that far? And if you do, you have that conversation. But for us, we always went back to, well, what is the tone of our show? And is that really needed for what we're doing?
To me, I think on Chucky, you know, we are once again with the TV show focusing on kids, as we have, you know, classically in our original movies. But I think it's part of what's so interesting about it is just that juxtaposition of the relative innocence of childhood, or the perceived innocence of childhood, set against whatever the evil is that you're depicting in your specific story. In our case, Chucky. I think they're just, on an aesthetic level, even those two colors are just fascinating to work with, the good and evil. And, you know, children just personify that in a way that kind of works as a shorthand. But I think it's also interesting to kind of play with that and play with those expectations, because as we know, increasingly, I would say, you know, that the notion of the innocence of childhood is probably under attack in our culture in a way, because of all of the various influences that kids are bombarded by.
Which obviously, didn't exist when a lot of this stuff was written. You know, interestingly enough, on Creepshow, reading stories, developing stories, I was really surprised to find out how many writers were pitching these stories that actually revolved around kids. That the introduction of the stories were always, it was somebody in high school age or younger. And everybody on this call knows that shooting with kids is challenging when you're on set, because you have a limited amount of time, and it's always a little tricky to deal with the keeping everything safe on set for kids and all that kind of stuff. But I was really intrigued that when we've been developing season 2, one of the things was, damn, all these stories all have kids. It is that innocence that Don was talking about. It's that idea that, you know, a gateway into some sort of supernatural world really does involve this sort of blank slate, this kind of wide-eyed wonder of believability. And I think that's what kids bring to the genre.
You know,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just off on the innocence stuff. One of the things that I think that's interesting is that the way that Joe Hill talks about the kids in Nosferatu. Joe wrote Locke and Key. He also wrote the novel Nosferatu that the show is based on, and is an EP on the show. And he says that in Nosferatu, what happens is Charlie takes a kid, like kidnaps a child, sticks him in the back of his wraith, and as the car makes its way slowly to Christmas Land, which is a place in Charlie Manx's imagination, the car drains them of all of their unhappiness and regret and any bad feeling. Charlie's point of view on it is, I'm giving these kids Christmas every day, and it's a wonderful place that I'm taking them to. And from his point of view, it's like they're going to be innocent forever here. And what Joe is fond of saying is, or pointing out to us all, is that an innocent kid will rip the wings off a butterfly. There's something about when there's only good feelings that aren't tempered with feelings of regret or feelings of you know, I'm sorry for this, or then you actually wind up with monsters. He's kind of like, it's interesting because I feel like he's interested in the monstrosity of innocence in a weird way.
Yes, I could see that. I think if I had to face someone in war, I would rather face an adult soldier than a child soldier, because yes, once you take away those layers of innocence, there is some monstrosity that can come out underneath. So that's really great. I wanted to ask Greg Nicotero, and in particular, since you bring up Creepshow and the anthology format, how is that different? Because in episodic TV, you have your own challenges, but this is, you know, you have one chance, one episode. What is the perfect story for Creepshow? What are you looking for?
Oh, well, you know, the hardest thing was having been on Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead with Jami, and, you know, I was accustomed to, you know, reoccurring characters and sets and locations. And then you get into the anthology aspect of it, and you realize that every 3.5 days, you're creating an entirely new world. New sets, new script, new director, new actors. So I think I was a little insane when I initially started this process. But there was something really, for me, you know, having grown up literally almost as a next door neighbor to George Romero. And I just love, I want to have fun. I want to be entertained. You know, when I read these stories, what's most important is that I kind of get a little bit of a chuckle out of it, even if it goes to a dark place. I always really want to have fun with it. And, you know, both Meredith and Jami, you know, get to work with Joe, who I adore. And I see, it's intriguing to me because I see so many similarities between Joe and his dad, who I met when I was probably 18 years old. But I think creating a new world has its challenges because you're limited just in terms of the amount of stuff that you can actually do. But we have this great comic book device too, which allows us to tell a little backstory and to do some comic book page turns. You know, I always thought that Creepshow was way ahead of its time when George and Steve did it in the early 80s. It was just, you know, it was their tribute to EC Comics. And now my Creepshow is sort of a tribute to all those guys that I was fans of when I was growing up.
That's great. And of course, the rest of you have the opposite problem with episodic TV. You have so many more hours than in a film to develop the characters in their world. Does that make it easier or harder to scare the audience? Because on one level, your audience knows that a lot of these major characters are going to be okay, right?
It's a different kind of scare. I think in TV, in serialized TV, and to me the best example of this is Twin Peaks. What I try to achieve is that sense of continuing pervasive dread, a kind of atmosphere that pervades the entire show, and that feels like an ongoing nightmare or a dream. My preferred version is the seasonal anthology. You get 6-8 episodes. You can tell a complete story. You can see where you're going. You know that some of these characters might be able to die, but you still have more real estate than in a film, and it's kind of a unique beast.
That real estate allows us to get more into the characters than we can in any individual 90-minute movie. So there's more opportunity to create that kind of dread and suspense that Nick is alluding to than we did in the movies. That's, for me, the biggest opportunity that I saw in taking our franchise from film into TV, was to really make it more of a story about characters than it had ever been before, including Chucky's character, by the way.
Well, yeah, and I'm glad actually to talk to you a little bit about that, Don, because Chucky has been around forever and has scared the crap out of me forever. And I'm really excited about it coming to television, but there is that difference in scope. In a movie theater, the scares are larger than life. There's a kind of immersion that happens when you're looking up on a screen. Even a doll like Chucky is huge when you're looking up on the screen. But with horror TV, sometimes people are watching on their phones, right? When they're watching TV. So you have that extra challenge. Could you talk a little bit about how you want to make it fresh again, especially in a new medium? And is there anyone else that's been on this journey with you from the beginning?
Well, let's see. From David Kirshner has been my producing partner since the 80s when we first started the franchise. He bought my script, the original script, when I was a student at UCLA. And we both feel incredibly fortunate that this has just gone on to have this kind of longevity. You can never plan that kind of thing. It just feels like, you've won the lottery. But I'm also happy to mention that another obvious important person involved in all of the films has been Brad Dourif, who is the voice of Chucky all these years. And Brad is going to be coming back for the TV series, of course, once again, to voice Chucky. But getting to the other part of your question, the difference between Chucky scaring people on the big screen, where he can loom large and amongst the looming high above the theater goers. Now, as you say, people are going to be watching it on their phone. So fundamentally, it almost comes down to, this is simplistic, but more close-ups. More close-ups and less wide shots is really part of your marching orders. But Chucky's handsome, so he can take it.
If it were up to you all, speaking of television and streamers, sometimes the streamers will dump out the entire series at once. Sometimes we're still on the week-by-week schedule. If it's up to you, would you want your episodes to roll out weekly or all at once as a binge? Do you have a preference as a viewer or as a creator?
It goes back to kind of what Nick was talking about sustaining the tension. When I like to be in that space and stay there. It's very hard as an audience member, and I think as a creator, to make a 42-minute episode of television and build that tension, sustain that tension, and then the episode's over. And then next week you have to kind of do it all over again. How do you get people back in that space? And so that's why working in streaming, I've found that to be easier because you've already kind of got them in that space. But that said, like Channel Zero, to Nick and Don's credit, like I watched that was appointment television for me. And every time I came back to a new episode a week later, they managed to get you right back there. So it can totally be done. It's just harder. And who wants things to be harder?
I like, for me, when we did Creepshow, we dropped Creepshow. I binge watch stuff as well, but I like the anticipation that builds. I think that probably goes again to sort of when I was younger and you'd get the TV guide and you'd go through the TV guide and you'd see what movies and what TV shows were going to be on, and you anticipated when it was coming and when you were going to get it again. So for Creepshow, I like that we dropped it once a week, but also it's a little different, Meredith, because I'm not telling the same story from week to week. I have a whole new story.
It's a complicated answer for me because as a viewer, my automatic answer is I like it when everything's dropped at once because I like to sit down and binge watch. And, when Mindhunter comes on or whatever, I watch the whole thing in a night or any of my, but when I'm forced to digest it week to week, it maybe stays with me a little bit more. And like my wife and I were just watching Mrs. America, which, was week after week after week. And I think the strategy that Hulu and some of the other places do now, and we did this on The Act as well, which was Hulu, is do a couple of episodes at first. So like the first 3 episodes, and then after that, week to week. And as a creator, I think that's my favorite version because it allows people to binge and get invested, and then it tortures them a little bit by dragging it out. So a hybrid is kind of ideal in my case.
Plus, it's nice to have those water cooler moments to inject that into the culture. When you have that week-long pause, you allow for people in the midst of all that anticipation and suspense, wondering what's going to happen next week. People are talking about it, and I think that that's really valuable with regard to, you know, the product staying power, the story staying power.
Yeah, like we work really hard to craft episodes on Nosferatu, and to what you guys are saying, it's like it's funny because I do think that there are pleasures to both versions, you know, but I like that our work in the writers' room, in which we've like each episode has a theme and had, like, you know, we've worked really hard on making these little episodes in addition to making the series long arc. And so it's not, I do think that episodes stick with you better when you watch them week to week than when you just kind of binge the whole thing.
And all of that is dependent, obviously, on the characters. I happen to think that characterization is paramount in all horror. I can tell in the first 10 minutes in a film, for example, if I'm going to care based on how they've developed those characters. But in TV, it's that times 10. People are tuning in week by week to be with these characters very often, right? So like with you, Jami, in Nosferatu, they're seeing Ashley's journey, right? As she's coming into her power from this unlikely place, in a town and a family where she felt no hope. So how do you balance the creation of relatable characters and the unfolding of the supernatural?
Yeah, you know, it's a tricky, I'll be honest, it's a tricky balance, and it's something that we're constantly talking about. One of the things that attracted me to the book Nosferatu was this incredibly nuanced portrait of this blue-collar family at the center of it, that I felt like I hadn't seen that much care go into a family like that. There it is. On TV in a long time. And actually, I think that that's one of the strengths of Locke Key as well. And so I really wanted to honor that. And that for me was like the way in, because Christmas Land and Charlie Makes and all that stuff is wonderful. But I was afraid that if we didn't care about these people, we wouldn't care about any of that either. So the way that we kind of strive to manage it, the supernatural versus the real world drama, because our show is kind of like, there's a whole fantasy land in Christmas Land, and then there's like a kitchen sink drama happening. And how we kept asking these questions, like, how is this the same show? How do like, if someone walks away and they come back, how do they not feel like they've just turned the channel? And our answer in the writer's room was that, each character has their own kind of powers and ways that they access these supernatural worlds. And this again is like taking our cue from the book. This is present in the book as well, but we tried to be really stringent about Vic can't open up her bridge just because she wants to go to the mall. There always has to be a character need for her to be able to access her inscape. There always has to be an emotional charge and a strong character drive for any of these characters to be able to access their supernatural abilities. And so the hope is that then anytime you're in a supernatural scene or a supernatural world, it is actually grounded in a real world need and a real world character impulse.
Yeah, I think it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about before with the Shining and the classics. Any great horror story has to have a foundation that is non-supernatural, a human foundation. Rosemary's Baby, you're supposed to be able to trust your husband when you're pregnant. He's supposed to help you out. And instead he sells you out for his career. Like, that's a powerful story, even if it's not supernatural. And I think when crafting that, the same principle applies in TV. You just have to make sure that there's a really strong foundation emotionally and psychologically.
I feel like any serialized form, whether it's a graphic novel or a television series, it pretty much demands that kind of richness with character. If we don't service that, we're not utilizing these media correctly, because narrative, when you're weaving any kind of narrative as it's going on, the characters and the relationships must evolve. So when you have 8 episodes, 8 hours as opposed to 90 minutes, you're really required to keep those characters and relationships evolving. Otherwise, it just becomes static. But I think it's also important to look at it. I look at it as a first-time showrunner as opportunity. You know, it's really an opportunity to tell a potentially richer story than we ever have.
Fantastic, all of those answers. I'm thinking about television in particular and how far you can go with your characters in terms of the horror aspects. Is there a difference in how far you can go when you have a show on basic cable like AMC or Sci-Fi versus HBO or Netflix or Shudder? Do you think anything about your shows would change if you had to move your series from one to the other? Or do you find yourself pushing up against boundaries or no?
Well, when Nick and I set up Chucky at the Sci-Fi Channel, one of our first things we had to make sure of is that Chucky could drop his F-bombs, because it's such an intrinsic part of his character. It would just seem wrong if he couldn't. And fortunately, before we signed on the dotted line, they confirmed, yes, he can. I think he can drop 8 F-bombs per episode or something like that, 8 to 10, something like that. And I think maybe there's variation depending on what time it airs. Nick probably knows more about this than I do.
Well,
but
Don and I first worked together on staff on Hannibal, which is one of the goriest shows that's ever been on TV, and that was on network TV. And I still don't know how they were able to get away with that.
Stylization, I think. I think stylization is one's friend. If you're on network and you're faced with those limitations, I think Nick and I learned this from Brian Fuller, to view those challenges as opportunities to do something more interesting potentially. Because a lot of times it's the implication of violence as a visual cue can be more interesting than the gore itself. That makes sense. It's like the fin that is cutting across the surface of the water of the shark is arguably just as terrifying as seeing that the jaws clamping down on someone.
On Locke Key, we get 2 per season.
2 per season?
2 per season, and
wow.
That's so that we qualify for the rating that allows us to be available to the most amount of subscribers that pull up their service. So when our first drafts of the first 10 episodes of season 1 had for days, a lot of, and so Carlton and I did a pass where we removed the, and you find that you don't necessarily need them. You realize how unnecessary a can be, sometimes very necessary. Chucky, super necessary. Bodie Locke, probably not as necessary.
You know, in the 70s, there was such an uprising. The ratings board and Dawn of the Dead came out and it was unrated, and you couldn't show this and you couldn't show that. And we worked on Casino, and when Pesci put the guy's head in the vice, like, they were cutting everything out. We do that on TV now. We do stuff on TV that they told us we couldn't do in movies as recently as 10 years ago. The stuff that we get away with on Walking Dead in season 1 was more than George Romero could get away with on Land of the Dead. And, you watch Game of Thrones, you watch any of these shows, genre shows, man, we get away with a lot more.
Okay, so we can really push the envelope now with gore, but at the same time, as a society now, there are a lot of sensitivities developing around real life issues, social issues. I wanted to ask you, Meredith, because Locke & Key has a very different tone, and anyone else can jump in, but then say The Haunting of Hill House, where you're dealing with some really heavy subjects, as in the Bent Neck Lady episode and suicide, and the conversations around suicide. So I'm just wondering how fans' reactions impact how human horror will play out against the supernatural when you're dealing with real life issues, problems like addiction, suicide, and how do you tackle these with sensitivity?
I mean, I think it's incredibly important to tackle them with sensitivity, and I love working in this genre because it allows us to tackle these bigger real world issues, but through this other prism, so that they don't have to feel so, preachy or, after school especially. And, Hill House was a show that very much dealt with grief, but also just as much dealt with mental illness, and asked these questions about is it inherited? Was Nell, did her time at Hill House instill this in her in some way? Was it something that she was always, was it something that was always destined to take her down? Was she always destined to find herself at the top of that staircase? Did she have any free will in it at all? And these are questions that I don't have the answers to, and I don't feel that it is my place to answer them. So I prefer, as a storyteller, to just ask those questions and let it be more kind of ambiguous and open to interpretation, what exactly happened with her in that house on that staircase. Because for me, that is the way that I prefer to treat it with sensitivity, is just by asking the questions and allowing it to be open to interpretation, as opposed to, landing on specifically where I think it falls.
Great. And also, Nick, I wanted to also bring up Channel Zero, because I have been a fan from season 1. And I noticed that in the last season that we had the story of a Black couple. And that, of course, was a big thrill to me as a Black horror viewer and Black horror lover. I'm wondering if that was a deliberate choice, and how do viewers respond to more racial inclusion in their horror?
In the writer's room, it wasn't a deliberate choice, because and this is the case with all the seasons of Channel Zero, the story points, aren't contingent on the race of the main characters. But when we went into casting, I had worked with Brandon Scott, who plays Tom, in the previous season. And so he was one of the first people that we thought of for that role. And he came in and read for it and was, unsurprisingly perfect. And Maria was just great in the audition. So, even if we didn't plan for it in the writer's room, like once you make the casting choice, then you have to sort of look at the scripts and make sure that you're being sensitive and talk to the actors. Interestingly, the guy who plays Pretzel Jack is Black as well. I mean, he's completely covered in prosthetics and makeup, so you wouldn't know. But I mean, he's cast obviously for his incredible flexibility. I mean, there's literally no one else in the world who can bend his body like that. So we ended up, all 3 of our leads were Black in that season.
So kind of by accident, like actually Romero always said was the case with Dwayne Jones in Night of the Living Dead.
Well, with a few exceptions on the show, like Rutger Hauer or John Carroll Lynch, who were offer only, we just auditioned people, and we kept it as open as possible. And yeah, I mean, Brandon and Maria are amazing actors who, obviously I've worked with Brandon twice, and both of them I want to work with again. And when you find somebody like that, who, you keep them in mind for other stuff. You want to. Everybody knows how valuable a great relationship with an actor who's talented and a wonderful person is. So
fantastic. Well, I loved it. Loved the season. I loved every season. How do you pick those urban legends? What's the perfect urban legend for Channel Zero?
The perfect one is a story that is a seed for something else. So that 4th season, the story is about this long that it's based on. Is my hand where the camera is? Yeah. And it literally is just effectively, I moved into this house, and my wife and I found a door downstairs, and I let something out of it. I mean, it's a paragraph. And looking at that, I just wondered, like, what is that couple's story? What is the wife is mentioned in like a sentence in that story, and she became the main character of the season. And a story like that creates a sense of dread that you can preserve, and that has a lot of opportunity for elaboration was generally the guideline. And each season we like to say was intended to feel like the nightmare that you might have after you read the story, you know, and it sticks in your head a little bit, and then you bring your own demons and your own ideas and fears and personal stuff to it.
So really, this is my last question. And even though it's about graphic novels, if anyone wants to address it outside of the graphic novel space, that's fine too. Graphic novels really lend themselves well to adaptation because they're visual and they're pretty much storyboarded. But what are some of the specific challenges of adapting graphic novels to TV? And you could expand that to any adaptation, really, but graphic novels in particular are really huge right now.
Well, obviously there are just things that just work so much better in a splash panel than on screen. There is this one splash panel of Locke Key that Gabriel Rodriguez drew of the inside of Bodhi's head, which they use a key called the head key, which allows you to literally open up your skull and see what's inside. And there's this incredible 2-page panel of what the inside of Bodhi's head looks like. And it's amazing. There's like a T-Rex and it's just insane. And we weren't going to be able to, could you replicate that on screen? You could, but you know, it's very expensive / could, you know, look very silly. So we had to say, well, how can we replicate the feeling of what it would be like to go inside someone's head, this mechanism, that this head key, the way we use this for our show. And so it became a challenge, but it was some of the more fun conversations we got to have in the room about like, well, what do the inside of our characters' heads look like, and coming up with a different way of how you access someone's head. And in our version, you stick the key in the back of someone's neck, and in that room, a door appears. And what that door looks like is very specific to the character. So when the key goes in the back of Bodhi's neck, a giant toy chest appears in the room, and the characters open the toy chest and enter the toy chest, and then they walk into a space that is Bodhi's head.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because a lot of the comic book frames in The Walking Dead, they're iconic and the fans expect them. And there have been instances where we have referenced specific panels, you know, going back again to, you know, the Negan's introduction and, you know, Stephen Yun's murder on the show. And like, I remember reading that graphic novel, that comic book issue, and I was disturbed. There were drawings that stuck with me emotionally. I was sitting at a table with Stephen and Robert Kirkman, and they were talking about the comic book. I'm like, what are you guys talking about? And then Stephen opened it up, and what really, really haunted me, and there was a lot of images in the Walking Dead comic book that were pretty haunting, was the idea that it was just this horribly random, senseless, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. You know, even in the comic book, you know, Lori and the baby are killed when the governor attacks the prison. You know, there's a lot of really intense things that happen, and I was impressed that the drawings solicited emotion from me, just seeing a splash page. And so in a lot of instances on Walking Dead, it wasn't that we were using them as storyboards, but we were trying to elicit a similar emotion. And I think that's something that the comic book artists do very well, is that their job is to elicit emotion in a quick drawing, whereas we get to move them around a little bit. So I feel like there's been a lot of instances where we've been able to capture the emotion behind a panel in a comic book. And that sort of, you know, bonds the viewer with the reader. So
really fantastic to meet all of you virtually. Thank you so much for your insights into creating horror for television. And that's our panel.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.